The growing anger across this country over the shooting death of that unarmed teenager, Trayvon Martin. Tonight here, a friend of that neighborhood watch captain speaking out about what George Zimmerman told him. And we learn how Zimmerman plans to defend himself. This new portrait comes as thousands headed to church today, praying for the teenager and his family in New York and around the country, wearing hoodies in church. This congregation singing for Trayvon Martin. All of those prayers and song as the gunman's friend and his attorney sit down with us, describing for the first time those final moments between the teenager and the man patrolling that neighborhood.
Across the nation, the rallies in support of Trayvon Martin, the unarmed teenager shot and killed by the head of that neighborhood watch. A mother and the sign that reads, "Trayvon is my son too." Anger growing because the man with the gun, George Zimmerman, hasn't been charged. Today, we sat down with Zimmerman's lawyer.
How does he react?
I think he's surprised of the magnitude of the way things have taken off. This has become a national issue over calling him a racist, and that's definitely not who George Zimmerman is.
You say that Zimmerman is surprised when he sees the anger across the nation, but this was a teenager who was unarmed, who had gone out to get Skittles and was on his way home, but who's no longer with us. How does someone not understand that there would be this kind of reaction?
To me, that's only part of the story. George Zimmerman suffered a broken nose, and he had an injury to the back of his head. He was attacked by Trayvon Martin on that evening.
So you are going to argue that this was a case of self-defense?
The evidence will show that it's a case of self-defense, yeah.
Are you going to use the stand your ground defense?
I believe that's going to be applicable in this case.
The stand your ground defense, the law in Florida and several other states that says that someone who feels threatened has no duty to retreat.
You say this is going to be a case of self-defense, but when we heard that call to the police and the dispatcher saying, "Are you following him?"
Are you following him? Yeah. Okay, we don't need you to do that.
Okay, we don't need you to do that. So why did he continue to follow Trayvon Martin?
Those are questions that will be answered.
Will it be hard, though, to build a case of self-defense when you hear those words, "You don't need to be following him"?
I think it'll become clear at that time.
And today, we heard from Joe Oliver, a family friend who spoke with George Zimmerman just this weekend.
The reason why he was following this suspicious person that he saw was because that neighborhood has had a rash of break-ins.
But is that his job as the captain of the neighborhood watch when a dispatcher says, "You don't need to follow him"?
I don't know. I've never been a neighborhood watch captain. I do know that George had no intention of taking anybody's life. He cried for days after that happened.
He says the headlines have also taken a toll on Zimmerman and his wife.
He's moved. They've disconnected their phone numbers. They're in hiding. They're fearful. There have been people who have accused George of profiling. Well, I would think that as a watch commander, you are keeping an eye out for people you don't recognize in your neighborhood.
But you look at his record. I mean, he called 911 49 times in the last year. So you've got to wonder, how trained was that eye?
But I don't know how many calls he made where they weren't false alarms.
We can all hear that moment of screaming on the 911 tape. When you hear that?
I hear George. I do hear George.
Because Trayvon Martin's family has said they hear their teenager.
I'm sure they do.
And after talking with George Zimmerman, he says he is convinced it came down to that final moment.
At that point, either George or Trayvon was going to die.
As a family friend, do you wish that George had listened to the dispatcher who said you don't need to follow him?
Of course.
The case goes to the grand jury April 10th, and Zimmerman's attorney indicating to me today that he does believe charges are coming.